Hey guys, Mr. Poki here, back with another video. As you guys can see, I don't have my game screen up. Alright, I'm not playing Honkai Star Rail because this is gonna be a rather special video. Right. I've been thinking about making this video for the past, I dare say, couple of weeks, right? As you guys would have already known from the thumbnail, it is something about meta evaluation, right? Something regarding tier list, meta evaluation, all that kind of stuff. Generally speaking, I really don't like this kind of videos because as compared to most of the content in my channel, they are pretty objective in their viewpoints, right? For example, all the CA unit analysis, all the Pokies Academy, they're all based on like hard facts, right? You can't really dispute like A is A, B is B, right? That is that. But whenever it comes to things such as tier lists or like meta, right, these kind of things, one man's trash is always gonna be another man's treasure. Right? Everybody's gonna have different opinions regarding their favorite waifus, favorite units, what's their build, all this kind of stuff, team comps. So there really is no right answer, I would say. Maybe they have similar answers or something like popular answers, but there really is no one right answer. Somebody is always going to have something different to say regarding this kind of meta things. So that's why I think for me, especially when it comes to my channel, I try to be as objective, as unbiased, and provide just factual information to my viewers, right? So I didn't really want to make this video, but as we are coming to a close in version 1.1, and we're going to version 1.2 probably 1 week from now from the making of this video, I still want to give my viewers my own personal feelings, right? My own personal opinions when it comes to how the units in Honkai Star Rail fare. I really did my best to be as unbiased and as objective as I could possibly get, as you guys can quickly see from the way I judged all the units, right? It's not just a generic like an S plus or S or A, B kind of tier with just a single number. No, I have a very systematic step when it comes to ranking these units. Hey guys, Editor Poki here, back from the future. So in the midst of me editing this video, I realized that this is taking far too long and it's not possible for me to fit both support class and sustain class within the same video, because if I'm gonna be doing that, the entire video is gonna take probably near to like an hour or maybe 15 minutes. In the same time, I also don't really want to cut down and edit out my explanations for all of the different classes. I want to give you guys a more in-depth look as to why each of the units have their score given to them, right? So for that reason, I'll be splitting this video into two different segments. Stay tuned to the next segment where I'll be covering both the support class and sustain class and basically wrapping up the entire video. Right. So without further ado, let's get into today's content. Right, so let's get into a little bit of a disclaimer first before we really get into like the meat of today's content, right? Some general information about me, right? Hi guys, I'm Mr. Poki. I'm basically cleared 30 out of 30 MOC for like the past couple of cycles already. I have no E6 units and most of my units are basically at E0. I stamina top up around 2 times a day and I do really extensive background research with regards to the gameplay mechanics, team comms, each of the units. So this is basically my background. I'm not somebody who's a whale. I don't have like insane relics, insane traces, all that kind of stuff. I would just say I'm like better than average when it comes to an account progression, right? Like I said again, this is just my feeling, my opinions, right? Player expectations will differ based on like their gacha, their relics, their levels, like their trailblazer levels. This is not meant to be the absolute truth, right? This is just based on my own experiences within Honkai Star Rail, and I hope to give my viewers another possible perspective. So maybe after hearing Mr. Poki out, you guys can come to your own conclusions like, hey, actually his viewpoints are very similar to mine, or hey, actually his viewpoints are very different from mine, right? So this kind of stuff is really up to your own digestion, right? I'm just here to offer another perspective based on my own experiences. One thing to note is that some of the units within this meta-analysis is not included if I either don't use them at all or I have no interest in using them. Last point, at the end of the day, all units are viable with enough investments. Because in Honkai Star Rail, you can literally just clear MOC with like a full no gacha account. Granted, you spend a lot of stamina on your relics, and they can still do 30 out of 30 MOC clears, like with absolutely zero pools, right? So at the end of the day, your unit strength, their viability is always going to be tied to your investments, your tracers, your relics, your light cones, all that kind of stuff. It is not up to the unit's kit itself. The unit's kit does not determine whether they're gonna be in A tier or B tier, right? Now, as you guys can see here, the evaluation will be applied to all units split into 3 main categories, right? Your DPS, support, and sustain. Keep in mind that a single unit can in fact appear in multiple categories depending on its build, right? So for example, if you're gonna be using Seele as a main DPS, such as with crit build or her break effect, then we're gonna be judging Seele's DPS capabilities, right? So we're not gonna be focusing that much on her debuffs. On the other hand, Seele's debuffs will then be a focus when we judge her in the support category. So basically, a unit can appear in multiple categories and we will be judging them according to what category they are in. So for DPS, we'll be judging them based on single/multiple targets. Also, whether they're going to be a main DPS or a sub DPS, we're also going to be judging on that. For supports, we're going to be including both harmony buffers and nihility debuffers. And lastly, for sustain, we're going to be including abundance healers and preservation shielders and taunters. Keep in mind, like I mentioned at the start of the video, we're going to be splitting this content into 2 separate videos. So for this first video, we're going to be talking about DPS alone, and then for the next video, we're going to be talking about support and sustain classes, right? Because if I were to squeeze everything into a single video, it's going to be far too long. In the meantime, I don't want to edit out most of my detailed explanation, so you guys might not even understand where I'm coming from. So I think splitting this into 2 will be the best path. But without further ado, let's jump into how our version 1.1 DPS meta evaluation is going to look like. Alright, so I believe that everybody, or rather every single gacha players, are familiar with this tier maker, right? This is how you make tier list. So no exception, we're going to be using this for our meta evaluation as well. Keep in mind, some of the characters here, like you see Fu Xuan, Jing Liu, I don't even remember her name, they're definitely not going to be included, but since their characters is there, we're just going to leave them there, right? And like I said, also, some of the units I'm not going to cover, I'm just going to be placing them as unused. But even though they're unused, I might just give a little general comments here or there. Alright, so let's begin with our very first unit, and that's going to be Seele. I'm just going to say right now, Seele, she's automatically going to go up to the S+ tier. And honestly, I think she's the only unit that's worthy of this S+. In fact, let me just rename this to Seele, because honestly, no other units just come close to what she has to the table, and here is the reason why I think Seele is really just in a league of her own, basically, right? She is the highest single target damage of all time. Ever since version 1.0 all the way until version 1.1, she still is this insane damage potential, right? But the entire resurgence mechanic is just straight up overpowered, I would dare say broken, because she gets extra turn from killing mobs, which essentially eradicates the need for us to use erudition units. Like, if you already have Seele clearing mobs, then why would we even need to use erudition units in general, right? Secondly, during her resurgence, all her buffs on her are maintained, right? All your Bronya's buffs, Ting Yuan buffs, even if the buff is only supposed to last for 1 turn, because of Seele's resurgence not counting as another turn itself, is basically like a special mechanic, like a 0.5 turn, right, basically. Also, she has a lot of insane personal buffs. She has quantum rest penetration, she has a lot of damage buffs for herself, all her multipliers are super crazy, and let's not forget that she has the best Hun light cone in the entire game, right? And her kit just synergizes so well, because the more speed she has, the more damage she's gonna do, right? So because of all these factors combined, I believe Seele is really the GOAT, right? The greatest of all time in terms of damage dealing, in terms of DPS. Her weakness, I believe every single unit here would have some sort of weakness, but Seele's weakness, I believe she's really hard to make use of at full efficiency if her gears are not developed properly, right? Like, if your relics are really weak and she cannot really trigger her resurgence in due time, such as if she's not capable of one-shotting the enemy mob to trigger resurgence, then you're not really going to see the full effect of Seele, right? Because in that case, if you're going to be taking 2 turns to kill 2 units, because that's how long it takes for you to proc resurgence, then you might as well just use 2 turns to use Jing Yuan's E, right? Jing Yuan's E can just probably just clear both mobs in the same amount of turns. So that's why her greatest weakness right now is just it can be a little bit tricky if you're not able to give her the proper relic investments. But that being said, this is not really like a really strong weakness, because technically this applies to every single one of the DPS units here, right? As long as their relic is not strong enough, then you shouldn't expect to see very high damage numbers, right? It's like you can't be expecting to get A for a test if you haven't even done your homework. But this is especially important for Seele, because if she can't proc her resurgence, then a large chunk of her kit is going to be missing in value, right? So that is that for Seele's one and only weakness that I can think of. I guess another thing I can talk about is also Seele's longevity, right? Is Seele future-proof? Is Seele going to be power crap in the future stages? Well, in my opinion, in terms of a DPS perspective, I think she is the most future-proof DPS we have right now. Because the way I see it, if Seele were to ever get power cracked by a stronger DPS in the future, be it it has higher damage numbers or more interesting mechanics that can deal with mobs as well as single target just as well as Seele, then every other DPS in this category, they're also probably going to be power cracked by that DPS, that power cracked Seele, right? Because Seele is just so strong that there is really not much situation I can think of where a future unit only power creeps Seele and doesn't power creep any other unit. So in that sense alone, I think as of version 1.1, she has a really strong standing, even in terms of future proofness, right? So yep, that's why Seele is gonna be in a tier of herself, Seele tier basically. So let's go on to the next limited balance unit, which is gonna be Jing Yuan. R/Jing Yuan means I'm probably gonna get quite a bit of hatred for this, and I know people are already raising their pitchforks and all that kind of stuff, but personally, from my personal experience, and this is coming from somebody who has a E0 S1 Jing Yuan with all his traces at level 8, I'm gonna be giving him a B tier, right? I'm just gonna let the hate come out for a second, and then we'll continue, yeah? Right, so why is Jing Yuan in the B tier? Let's talk about his strengths right before we dive into all the weaknesses. Jing Yuan is the best lightning AoE DPS in version 1.1. There is no doubt about it. No other AoE DPS, not even like any other elements, can come close to what Jing Yuan has to offer in terms of AoE, right? With a proper team setup, Jing Yuan can pretty much just function really well. Like if you run him with Bronya, Asta, Tingyun, all these kind of supports with Jing Yuan as the hyper carry, he's really gonna do substantial amounts of damage, especially so if his relic is developed strong enough. Alright, so let's just talk about the weaknesses that Jing Yuan have, and some of these weaknesses I've mentioned it before in my CN Jing Yuan outreach video, and they're still pretty prevalent till this date, right, in version 1.1. So the very first issue is not so much Jing Yuan's issue, but more so of erudition unit as a class, right? They still suffer from this issue, right? The content we have doesn't really allow erudition class to shine. Now, what do I mean by this? Generally speaking, erudition class, they're meant to be a class that kills multiple enemies at the same time, right? They deal AoE damage and you basically clear the entire team very effectively. But the thing is, for MOC, or rather for all the late game MOC stages, you would much rather just prefer using like a Hun unit to kill one boss first before moving on to the next boss. There's various little situations that I can think of where you want to kill both bosses at the same time, but kill them at a later time, compared to you kill one boss earlier and then you kill the second boss, right? So think of this Cocolia as an example. In MOC9 Cocolia, she's there along with the Frozen Out of Space enemy boss. If you were to use erudition class unit in this scenario, where you kill both Cocolia and Ice boss at the same time, then the other Ice Elite is gonna deal a ton of damage to your team, right? He's gonna deal his Everlasting Winter, freeze your team, and Cocolia is also gonna be doing all kind of stuff because both of them are still alive, right? Whereas on the other hand, if you were to use a Hunt unit, right, it doesn't even have to be Seele, it doesn't even have to be Hunt. Like any unit that does a strong single target damage to immediately get rid of the elite boss, then it's gonna make your experience clearing MOC a lot easier, right? Because you have one less enemy to deal with, you have one less crowd control to worry about, all the kind of crit, all the kind of RNG. It is much better to fight a fight with one less boss unit than to fight a fight with both bosses lasting at the same time and then taking them out together, right? So that's the issue of erudition unit. Now let's move on to Jing Yuan's personal weakness and why I believe he is basically below average, right? Because as you can see here, A is average, and I really believe that Jing Yuan is below average, and this is why. Jing Yuan, as a kid, majority of his damage, they are backloaded, right? They are not front-loaded like most of the other DPS that we have, right? Every single other DPS we have, as long as it is their turn, they are able to deal most of the damage, 99% of the damage from the front-loaded aspect, right? They use a skill, they use the ultimate, their damage is done. But for Jing Yuan, you have to wait for Lightning Lord's turn before a majority of this damage can be output into the enemies. And that is a big issue in this kind of turn-based game. The longer it takes for your damage to become delivered, then the more chances there are for your team to fail, right? Because the enemy unit is still alive even after Jing Yuan takes his turn, right? It's only after Lightning Lord takes his turn, then we can see where the enemy unit is then. So even if Jing Yuan's Lightning Lord combined with Jing Yuan can deal more damage than, like, for example, Tan Heng or Yanqing, but the fact that Lightning Lord is backloaded just gives our enemy more room to cripple our team, right? He can cast his debuffs, he can cast his crowd control, all this kind of stuff. And I think it goes without saying that Jing Yuan is super weak to debuffs, right? The moment he gets crowd control before Lightning Lord takes his turn, then we have to wait for an entire cycle again to let Lightning Lord come back and deal his damage, right? We basically miss out a huge chunk of damage. And any debuffs done to Jing Yuan, such as attack debuffs, damage debuffs, all this kind of stuff, is also gonna affect Lightning Lord. So that's the issue with backloaded damage in general. The moment you allow enemy to live for the extra one more turn, then there's gonna be a lot more RNG factors for you to consider, and there's a chance that Jing Yuan might not even be able to get his damage out in due time, compared to every other damage character we have, which is essentially all front loaded, right? So that's the issue with Jing Yuan. his backloaded damage kit as well as his weakness to crowd control. And if you guys have played MOC, you guys will know how annoying crowd control can be, especially in MOC 9, MOC 10, this kind of stuff, right? Now, in terms of Jing Yuan's future-proofness, with regards to all the weaknesses, like I mentioned, right, his backloaded DPS, his weakness to crowd control, as well as Lightning Lord spreading his damage the more enemies there are, I don't really think Jing Yuan is going to be that future-proof, because the moment Mikoyo introduces a front-loaded AoE DPS, then there's very little chance where you will want to pick Jing Yuan over that front-loaded AoE DPS, right? Or even a lightning hunt unit, like a really good hunt unit. When that scenario ever happens, I think it's very hard to justify using Jing Yuan as a main DPS because of all his weaknesses. And you can't really pivot Jing Yuan into a sub DPS as well, right? If Jing Yuan's auto attack like can generate one Lightning Lord stack at least, then at least there's a chance for Jing Yuan to become a sub DPS, right? You don't have to be that skill point intensive for him. But because Jing Yuan can only generate Lightning Lord stacks with his skills and his ultimate, then there really is very little room for him to play into a sub DPS. And for that reason, I think Jing Yuan is also not going to be that future-proof in the long run. So for all these reasons combined, he's gonna be at a B tier. And I know r/Jing Yuan mains is gonna flame the crap out of me, but this is my opinion, right? This is gonna be a personal take. Now let's move on to the next limited banner unit, which also doubles as a DPS, that is Silver Wolf, right? But technically, Silver Wolf is not really, her main focus is not as a DPS, right? Her main focus, her entire kit, is to play as a debuffer, weakness implant, all the kind of good stuff, right? But because, like I said just now, we're going to be judging units if they're going to be dealing damage as well, if they can do damage, right? So in terms of a DPS perspective, right, this is purely from a DPS perspective, I'm going to be ranking Silver Wolf slightly below Jing Yuan in B tier, right? Because no matter how you want to put it, Silver Wolf really don't deal that much damage, right? Her kit is not meant to deal damage. Her kit is meant to be all the debuffs, weakness implant, defense down, speed down, all this kind of stuff is what makes her character great, right? So from a DPS perspective, you can't really expect Silver Wolf to be dealing that much damage. However, this is different if you have a very high Eidolon Silver Wolf, right? E4, E6 Silver Wolf, the multipliers for ultimate and all her skills, honestly, is actually insane if you manage to get an E6 or E4. But like I said, all these units, we're going to be taking them at a base E0 value. If any 5-star unit here is at E6, they can honestly all be Seele tier, right? But the thing is, we need to judge them from an E0 perspective. So from an E0 perspective, you really shouldn't be expecting Silver Wolf to deal that much damage. Even for the break effect Silver Wolf DPS possibilities, you still need her to break the target, right? So it is not really very consistent, because the moment if your break effect Silver Wolf doesn't break the target, then a huge portion of a DPS is going to go out of the window. With regards to all of Silver Wolf's support capabilities, such as her speed down, attack down, defense down, weakness implant, all this will be the factor only for the support/sustain categories, right? So I'm just going to give a heads up. If we're just going to be looking at Silver Wolf because of her support capabilities, right, her debuffs, she's going to be in Seele tier for sure, right? Because weakness implant is just that good. But because unfortunately this is a DPS version 1.1 meta-analysis, we're going to be dropping her at B tier for her DPS capabilities, right? Alright, with the limited banner units out of the way, let's get into the standard banner units. And the first unit I want to just deal with is Welt, right? I don't think I've made it hidden that I really like Welt's design, but his review here is definitely really objective and unbiased, and I believe that Welt is in S tier, right? Definitely above average. So why do I say this? I think for those of you guys who have watched out my streams in the past couple of weeks, and you've seen the amount of damage that Welt can output, even though he's meant to be played as an inhibitor character. I think at the start of the game, since 1.0, people are having the misconception that Welt should be used as a debuffer, right? You should only run him as a debuffer, stack on his imprison, stack on his speed debuff, then don't really care about his damage. But if you really just try to play Welt as a main DPS, just give him your standard crit ratio, all the damage, as much damage as you can see that he really does impressive amounts of damage, be it against a single target or against a group of mobs, right? Because his ultimate is really good for mobs, and his E, it can all stack onto a single target and just deal tons of toughness bar as well as raw damage itself. So that's why I say Welt is probably misunderstood since 1.0, where people treat him as somebody like a debuffer, when in reality, you really should think of Welt as somebody that can be a main DPS. If you build Welt as a main DPS, I can guarantee you guys, you will not be disappointed with his performance, right? So let's go into why I believe Welt is above average, or rather in S tier. So number one, I think he's really adaptable. He's really fluid, very similar to Seele basically, right? Because you don't really need to run him with a specific fixed comp. You can run him with some harmony supporters like Jing Yuan, Asta. You can also run him with debuffers such as Pella, Serval, and then all this you top it up with like a Luocha as a healer, right? He can be really flexible. So in terms of team composition, he's super fluid, right? So that's number one. Number two, when it comes to Welt's abilities as a main damage dealer, right, it's really quite impressive because not only does he deal substantial amounts of raw damage, he also brings to the table a lot of debuffs, right? So this is where Welt differs from Seelwolf. If we play Seelwolf as a main DPS, if you don't have Seelwolf's idolants like E4, E6, then you don't really expect to deal that much damage to Seelwolf. But that's different from Welt, because even at E0 Welt, if you build him as a main DPS, he's going to be dealing a substantial amount of damage, right? Unlike Seelwolf. So that's why his kit, aside from the damage that can deal, all the debuffs also benefit his entire team. Action value pushback, increased damage taken, speed debuff, imprison, all these are extremely good debuffs that not only amplifies his own personal damage, but also allow your team to basically go faster, right? Go more turns, right? Speed down and imprison, action value pushing, it's always going to be an extremely good mechanic within a turn-based game. So this is why Welt as a DPS has above average capabilities, right? But that being said, what are some of Welt's weaknesses? I believe Welt's weakness is basically, even though he can deal with mobs with his ultimate, but he's not really efficient with mobs as compared to, for example, Jing Yuan, right? Jing Yuan is super good with mobs. Anytime there's a mob, you use a skill, use a out, you can basically deal with mobs very easily. But for Welt, his only real way to deal with mobs is his ultimate. Even though his E is considered as like a multi-target, like a bounce, right? His damage is really not that great because the more enemies there are, the more it's gonna spread. Very similar to Jing Yuan's lightning lock basically. So because of this, his E cannot really effectively deal with mobs that well, and it's gonna take away from the main damage source. Like for example, if you're trying to aim for a boss, and the boss summons some kind of mob, this allows Welt's E to potentially bounce to the mob and take away his main damage that can be dealt to the boss itself, right? So this is why Welt's weakness is not really good with mobs. Now let's talk about his longevity, right? How future-proof can Welt be? I believe that the pure fact that Welt is a standard banner unit means it is not impossible for us, even free-to-plays or even Dolphins, to get some of his idolants, right? Because he's gonna be in the pool forever. So I think it's just a matter of time before you get some of Welt's idolants. And in case you guys haven't seen my Welt CN unit analysis, his idolants are extremely good. So in terms of a longevity standpoint, the more idolants you get of Welt, the more insane he's gonna be in your team, right? Even going into the future, when we do get Inhibitor Heng, which is this guy over here, he might deal more DPS than Welt, right? Even though we haven't really seen his numbers yet, but even in the event that he does more DPS than Welt and he becomes the main carry, Welt can just easily pivot into a sub DPS, right? Instead of using his skill all the time, he can just auto attack skill, and just cast his out every 4 turns, right? Still an excellent sub DPS. On top of this, he is one of the only units we have in the game right now that can enable us to use imaginary set on every single unit that we have. What is imaginary set, right? Imaginary set's 4-piece is the first criteria is if the enemy is debuffed, you gain 10% crit chance. And the second criteria is if the enemy is imprisoned, you gain 20% crit damage, right? So effectively, this is a 40 crit value 4-piece effect, which is insanely good. And Welt is the only unit right now that can enable the entire 40% crit value for anybody, right? It doesn't even have to be imaginary. It can be a Seele, it can be Qingque, it can be Heng. Anybody can use this imaginary 4-piece if they're tagging along Welt with their team, right? Because Welt can cast Imprison and all these debuffs, right? So that's why Welt is excellent even as a sub DPS. And for all these factors combined, he's gonna be getting a solid S tier. Now let's go into our next standard 5-star DPS, which is gonna be Clara. But like I said, I didn't really use Clara that much, so I'm gonna be putting her in the unused section over here, right? But I can still give a little general comments based on some of my experiences playing with Clara on my viewer accounts, all that kind of stuff, and taking a look at her kit. I think Clara, she's an excellent unit to use if you want to have a very free and easy time auto-battling MOC, right? I don't know if you guys have seen the videos where essentially just with Clara, Yukong and Luocha alone, you can pretty much just full auto an MOC stage. Like you can just go and like get a coffee and go eat your dinner or something, and Clara will just basically destroy the enemy with these 3 units combined, a 3-man team, right? the use is really quite niche, because if you're trying to defeat an MOC stage, right, an MOC stage that you cannot clear previously, I think if your Clara's gear development is not strong enough, then she's not going to bring a lot of value to your team, right? If you invested Clara strong enough, as you would have invested in any other main DPS, then I think she's not, say, worse or better than average. So I think generally speaking, Clara can be in the average tier if I were to ever go in that. But because I'm not really familiar with the kit, I'm just going to place her in the unused section. Any Clara mains in the chat, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below, or head on to Poke's Village and discuss it with my Discord over there, right? So that's that for Clara. Alright, now for our final standard banner 5-star DPS, it's going to be Yanqing, right? Okay, Yanqing. I'm going to be ranking Yanqing in the average. He really is the average, born and bred, true blue damage dealer, right? That's his entire kit, right? He doesn't really suck anything he does, but he doesn't really, say, have insane amount of utilities or excels any of it, such as Seele or Welt, right? He's really the average DPS. And now let's go into why this is the case, right? I think one very important thing that we need to understand as a player is that Yanqing is the only DPS that doesn't really care for crit chance. So building Yanqing is going to be really easy compared to any of the DPS here, right? Any of the DPS you see here, they are always going to want crit chance plus crit damage. But that's not the case with Yanqing. Yanqing is a character where you really just need to care about crit damage, and as long as his base crit chance is at around 20%, then he's going to have 100% crit chance with his ultimate. So in terms of building him, he's definitely going to be easier than your general DPS units, right? So that's that. Now looking at his damage capabilities, I believe that those of you guys who have played Star Rail since day 1, you would have seen that all the first few 30 out of 30 MOC clears, they're all done by Yanqing, right? Because back then, MOC 10, MOC 9, all this kind of stuff, all the bosses, they're weak to ice. So maybe Yanqing's use is not that strong right now in 1.1 because most of the weakness, they are quantum and imaginary. Back then in 1.0, a lot of the endgame bosses in MOC, they're weak to ice, right? And Yanqing really shined over there. If you had Yanqing back then in 1.0, you pretty much can always guarantee 30 out of 30 in MOC. Coupled with the fact that, of course, you need to pair him with a shielder, and that's why I'm going to be talking a little bit about Yanqing's weakness as well, right? But generally, in terms of his strength, if you ever find yourself in a position where you need an ice DPS, then Yanqing is really the best ice DPS that we have in version 1.1, right? I think Herta really just doesn't really compare that much with Yanqing, right? There's really no comparison. His damage is really high as long as you can ensure that he doesn't take any damage and give him all the proper due supports that he needs, proper relic investment. He's really the best ice DPS that we have. Now, his weakness. Yanqing is the only unit where I would say he's the most restrictive in terms of playstyle, right? Because even for Jing Yuan, even though Jing Yuan can be quite susceptible to crowd controls, you can still kind of cleanse him, like with a Bronya cleanse or Natasha cleanse, before Lightning Lord's take system. So in that case, then Lightning Lord maybe can still go and not be wasted in the time. But for Yanqing, is the moment he takes any form of damage, not even debuffs, like even a single damage to his health pool, then he's gonna be missing out a lot of his damage potential, right? Because Yanqing's talent, Soul Steal Sync, if it is not active, he's gonna be missing out 20% crit chance, he's gonna be missing out the follow-up damage, and he's gonna be missing out the potential to freeze, right? And all these damage. So the moment he takes any form of damage, a huge chunk of his DPS is gonna drop off, right? So that's why I say it can be a little bit restrictive to play Yanqing, whereas he really needs to have a shielder in his team. But lucky for us, most of our shielders right now we have in version 1.1, they are all ice units, right? It's either March 7th or Japat. And if you have played Yanqing with Japat, you will know that having Yanqing take no health damage at all is really not that difficult as long as you have Japat in your team, right? Maybe March 7 can still be a little bit of difficulty because March increases Yanqing's taunt value, so there's more chance for him to get hit. But Japat's massive team-wide shield, on top of if you were to use Japat with an ER rope and a speed boost, right, the shield can almost have a 100% uptime. So Yanqing is very likely to not receive any damage when you have Japat in his team. So very lucky for us, mono ice is really a very viable comp with Japat, Yanqing, probably like a healer and then another support, right? Like a Bronya or Ting Yun, right? So that's why this is Yanqing's weakness. He's a very conditional carry, but because the conditions are not very hard to achieve, it is not that big of a weakness. Another weakness I want to mention about Yanqing, very similar to Welt, but even worse, is that he really cannot deal with mobs, right? He really can't deal with mobs because all his skills are basically single target. There is absolutely no AoE whatsoever with Yanqing. But at least MOC, this is not a very big concern because most MOC stages, the bosses, they're gonna be the target that Yan Qing is gonna be focusing on. Especially in the final stages, like MOC phase 3, it really is just one elite and one boss. So it's okay, and it doesn't really spawn that many mobs, and Yan Qing can still deal with them relatively easily, right? But he really just cannot deal with mobs. Like the phase 1 out of the 3 different stages, Yan Qing is just not gonna do very well. Now let's talk a little bit about Yan Qing's future-proofness. I'm not sure if you guys know, but Jing Liu is gonna be coming sooner or later, eventually, and it is very likely that Jing Liu might power creep Yan Qing. Not even looking at Jing Liu's kit, right? We can already know that Yan Qing has a very basic kit. Just deal as much damage as possible, don't receive any damage, and he doesn't really have anything else going for him, right? He just deals tons of damage. The only unique thing about him is he doesn't really need to care about crit chance, right? But that's more of like a gearing uniqueness. It's not really like his kit uniqueness. So the moment Jing Liu comes out and she brings anything more to the table than Yan Qing, then I think Yan Qing can be very quickly replaced by Jing Liu. Another thing that I want to mention before we go to the next character is just like Jing Yuan, Yan Qing can't really pivot into a sub DPS. You really want to use his skill a lot of times because you want him to have his out as soon as possible, right? And his soul still saying all the kind of stuff is all tied to his skill. So not using skill with Yan Qing, even though it's not as punishing as Jing Yuan, where like if you don't use Jing Yuan's skill, he's not even gonna get lightning or stack. Yan Qing is not that punishing, but it's gonna be a big DPS drop off if you don't use Yan Qing's skill. But he also doesn't offer any other extra utilities if you were to use basic attack, right? So because of this, he also can't really pivot into sub DPS, and all these factors combined with his kit, all that kind of stuff, he's gonna be our average benchmark DPS unit, right? So the first character we're gonna be looking at in the 4 stars is gonna be Heng. So where does he place in all this? I think for Heng, he's pretty much gonna be behind Jing Yuan and above Silver Wolf in terms of a beat. I think he's below average. One thing I want to keep in mind is if you are a player that does not have any pulls, right? Like if you're gonna be playing an account with no pulls, not doing any gacha, not doing anything, you're just using the tutorial free characters, then Heng is gonna be in Seele tier, right? Because he really is the strongest free 4-star damage dealer that we had. So in that scenario, he's gonna instantly shoot up in ranking. But if you compare Heng with all the 5 stars that we have, in terms of DPS department, then he's just gonna unfortunately fall short. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Heng's kit. I think his kit is very simplistic. You want to buff Heng with a Harmony Supporter because he gains this additional wind rest penetration, and then you allow him to deal as much damage as possible by marking a speed down on an enemy and then casting his ultimate. That's gonna cause increased damage with Heng, right? So super simplistic kit, very much so like Yan Qing, right? Just deal as much damage as possible, give him the right harmony buffs, and so on and so forth. Can deal a lot of damage given the right relic investment, especially in version 1.1 this MOC cycle. There's a lot of wind weaknesses, right? So players that don't have access to Welt or like Jing Yuan or Seele, their Hengs are definitely gonna get used very frequently in this version 1.1. Especially in a scenario where right now looking at all units, we really don't have a good wind DPS until Blade comes out, right? But that's gonna be until Blade comes out. So for Heng, I think he serves the niche of a wind DPS really nicely for now. But why I say he's below average is basically because number one, he's a 4-star unit. I really don't want to be biased against 4-star units, but I think all 4-star units in general, their kits just fall a little bit short compared to the 5-star units. Else, why would people even want to use 5-star units, right? Like for example, his base stats is definitely going to be lower than all the 5 stars. His abilities, they are a lot more simplistic, one-dimensional compared to all the 5 stars, right? For example, even though Yan Qing is a very one-dimensional damage dealer, at least he still has something going for him. Like the follow-up attack, the only need to stack critical damage, also the chance to freeze, all this kind of stuff just makes Yan Qing stand out a little bit more than Heng, which is also a very simplistic single target DPS. Let's talk a little bit about Heng's weakness. His weakness, very similar to Yan Qing, is just he cannot deal with mobs, right? Until you get his E6 when he can kind of deal with mobs a little bit better, but it only resets on his ultimate, right? So you're not going to be able to refresh his ultimate cooldown very frequently with Heng. So really not that well against mobs. And I guess another weakness that he has, which is also tied to one of his kits, is just it is too simplistic. Other than the speed debuff that he offers to the enemy team, there's really nothing interesting going about in his kit. So in the future, and I think this ties into longevity, if there ever was the next win DPS, I think he can very easily get replaced just because of how basic his kit is. But one good thing about Heng is that he can pivot into a sub DPS because his speed debuff from his skill lasts 2 turns, right? Because it lasts 2 turns, he can technically just use skill auto attack, and then use his ultimate on the target, right? He doesn't really need to skill every single turn, even though that would be ideal to do the highest damage possible, but he can pivot into a sub DPS. So that's that for Heng. Let's look at our next 4-star DPS. Firstly, let's talk about Arlan, right? I really have nothing to say about Arlan because I've completely never used Arlan at all. I don't even know what his kit does because that's how little Arlan interests me. But maybe some Arlan mains can leave your thoughts down in the comment section on how we can actually make use of Arlan. But from my general consensus from Arlan is, along with all my players, all my villagers in my Discord, I don't want to say the word terrible, but he's just not up to par compared to all the DPS, right? But that's all I'm gonna say. I have no experience with Arlan and I have no intention of using him ever, so that is that for Arlan. Now, Herta. Also in the same category, I've pretty much never used Herta much at all. I used her a little bit back in CBT for her clearing mobs. I think back then she was actually pretty decent. But other than this, especially when you want to consider this is going to be our endgame, right, our MOC performance, I do see some insane CN videos. They buff Herta with like insane relic and her just one-shotting the MOC 10 boss with 0 turn clears. But unfortunately, like I mentioned, a lot of times any unit can be viable as long as they have good relics. But based on her kick herself, not very familiar, and I'm not going to discuss much about it as well. So this is going to be in the unused section. Same as for Himeko actually. Very similar to Herta. Basically, she's also an erudition unit that does the follow-up, do the AoE hit, and I've seen videos very early back in 1.0 where Herta and Himeko basically help us clear the daily farming Calyx mobs super fast, right? They can basically just use their follow-up attacks and just kill everything. But in terms of MOC, I'm also not very familiar with Himeko, though like I mentioned again, there has been clears with Himeko, 0 turn clears in MOC 10 as long as their relic is developed right now. But personally for me, I also didn't look that much into Himeko's kit, but generally speaking, I think she can act as a pretty decent sub DPS for the monofire team in the future, right? Because she doesn't need to be a main DPS, she just needs to be the one doing all the follow-up damages. And she can inflict burn as well, which can enable some wonky burn comps such as hook. But yeah, that being said, she's also pretty much unused. Any Himeko mains in the chat, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. Now let's talk about hook. I think generally speaking, in terms of fire DPS, right, especially when you consider we have so little fire DPS, she really is the best. I think she's better than Himeko, at least in my experiences playing with hook. Because if you guys remember, back in the very early days of me making content as a content creator, I used hook quite extensively, especially in Simulated Universe, because I just find her really fun as a kid. Like her enhanced attack, her ultimate, doing tons of damage. So I did have my fair share of fun with hook. But on a tier list spectrum, I'm gonna be listing hook behind Dunting, basically. Now, why is this the case? The issue, this is not really so much of a hook issue, but this is so much more of like an elemental issue. Because if you guys remember, the weaknesses shared by fire enemies, right? They are also shared by quantum most of the time. Like the freeze out of space, the enemy elite, Cocolia, all these units, even though they're weak to fire, they're also weak to quantum. And if players have ever had access to Seele or even Qingque, most of the time you would just much rather run them over hook. The entire quantum element just pretty much dominated the fire element, right? So this is just a little bit unfortunate. But going into the future, maybe we can see more content where fire elements gets to shine. So when that day happens, we're gonna re-evaluate again. But as of version 1.1, fire element just really doesn't have that much uptime in MOC. I'm not saying that Hook's personal DPS is not strong, she is strong, but something that bothers me with her kit is just no content right now really needs us to use a bruiser, right? A bruiser that can receive damage and deal damage at the same time. Because in MOC right now, you're perfectly fine just running a hunt or an erudition unit and let them just deal all the damage. Because a single healer like Natasha, Bailu, Luocha, or even Japat can sustain our hunt characters or erudition class characters really well, right? They're not in a situation where the enemy is doing so much damage that if we are using a hunt or erudition unit, they're gonna get one-shotted, right? So because of that, destruction class just doesn't really fare that well, because most of the time a hunt and erudition is just gonna have higher damage output, right? Because what's destruction class? Destruction class is somebody that can tank damage as well as dealing damage. But right now, we don't need our carries, like our main DPS, to be tanking damage, right? And for Hook, that's going to affect her because if you take a look at some of her skills and the traces, it's really defensive, right? She has the trace where she restores max HP whenever a talent is triggered, and she also has a trace where she reduces crowd control debuffs, right? All these kind of things are very like defensive focused. I much rather prefer my main DPS to be all in on offensive capabilities and let my supports buff them, and if it ever comes down to it where my main carry gets like crowd control or needs some healing, then my healers can be there to back them up, right? So I don't really need destruction class in general. So that's why Hook is going to be ranking below Dunting. But it's still going to be above Seele because let's face it, at E0 Seele wolf damage capabilities is really just not going to be that respectable, right? What are some of Hook's strengths though? I think Hook is going to be a very nice mono fire team unit because the entire kit is tied to burn, right? The burn mechanic is the signature for fire comps, and a lot of her talents, like her tracers, all that kind of stuff, it all ties to the target being burnt, right? And her enhanced skill with her ultimate does respectable amounts of toughness bar damage. So in that sense, in the future mono fire team, I think Hook can be a pretty decent main DPS for that day comes. And we don't really have any news of getting a main fire DPS in the next few patches. So if there ever was an event where we have a lot of weak enemies that are weak to fire, Hook can definitely see a play. But for now, in version 1.1, he's gonna be in this tier right here. Now, the next 4-star DPS we're going to be talking about is going to be our favorite gambling girl, Qingque, right? Qingque, she's in a bit of an interesting spot because if you're really lucky with her, you always get a 4 of a kind. You always just need to use 1 skill point, or don't even need to use skill point and you get 4 of a kind. The more 4 of a kind Qingque can obtain, the higher her ranking is going to go. So even though after all my CN unit analysis as well as the tower probability mechanic of Qingque, if you're someone that's lucky and you constantly get 4 of a kind of Qingque, like the RNG god favors you, she can easily be an S tier unit, right? Because playing her with very high up kind of 4 of a kind allows her to deal a significant amount of damage, especially if she's in E6, right? She basically recovers a lot of skill points. So in that sense, she can be an excellent, one of the best sub DPS units that we have in the game right now. Because for every single time she does an enhanced auto attack with a 4 of a kind, she generates 1 skill points at E6, right? So that is that if you're always lucky. But if you're not very lucky with Qingque, right, you're constantly spamming a lot of skill points trying to get her to 4 of a kind, and you just repeatedly cannot get her 4 of a kind, and her ultimate reach is also really slow, right? Then she can go all the way to the bottom of C tier, right? Because her entire kit is the whole 4 of a kind thing. No matter how much you want to play it, no matter how much you want to calculate the probabilities, if you're not getting 4 of a kind, then you're just not going to get 4 of a kind. So considering this very large difference in spectrum between a very high damage ceiling as well as a very low damage floor for Qingque, I'm gonna be giving her here this tier, behind Jing Yuan and above all other 4 stars, right? So why is this the case? Before we even talk about Qingque's strength and weaknesses, one thing to note is that this is a turn-based game where you can basically reset your runs if it doesn't go your favor, right? So I think most of you guys have been familiar by now. If a Seele doesn't create, you just go and reset. Same thing with Qingque. If she repeatedly doesn't get 4 of a kind on the specific stage, you can always just reset and just pray for a better RNG next time, right? So in that sense, she's gonna be a pretty reset intensive unit. So if you guys are okay with just constantly resetting with Qingque, then I think using her is not gonna be an issue. But if you want somebody to be a consistent damage dealer, then don't have very high expectations, even though if you check out my tower probability, you can definitely increase your odds of getting more consistent with Qingque. To find out more, please check out all my previous videos, CN unit analysis, and all that kind of good stuff, right? But let's talk about Qingque. If you don't get 4 of a kind of Qingque, basically large portion of her damage is gone. And this is something that is really beyond a player's control. Not like Yanqing's condition, right? Yanqing's condition is if he takes any damage, his damage is gonna drop off. For Jing Yuan's condition is if he gets crowd control, lightning not goes to second turn, then his damage is gonna drop off. But Qingque is really like, it really just you gotta pray, right? You gotta gamble and hope that you get 4 of a kind. So she's really something that's beyond a player's control, even though you can kind of get better at it, looking at the probabilities and kind of stuff. But there's only so much a players can do, so she's not gonna be at an average where you're gonna consistently be able to play around her weaknesses, right? She really is just, it is what it is. So sometimes she can be an S tier, sometimes she can be C tier, but because of this unreliability with her kit, I'm not gonna be able to justify her placing above Jing Yuan or like on A tier even, right? So that is why Qingque is at the tier where she is. And all this being said, right, Qingque can be a very good sub DPS because she basically don't even need to use skill points and she can still generate tiles, right? So it's a matter of time before you get 4 of a kind of Qingque as a sub DPS. So damage capabilities, if you're not going to be playing her as a main DPS, is still dead, right? And whenever she casts her ultimate, she's guaranteed to get 4 of a kind. So playing her as a sub DPS is honestly not a bad idea if you don't want to be using her as a main DPS. Then when it comes to longevity with Qingque, I think Qingque, the kit is just so unique and so fun that from a fun factor alone, I don't think any other character is gonna come close to the RNG that's provided by Qingque. So in terms of a fun and this kind of stuff, right, I think Qingque can be pretty future-proof. If you want to play gacha within the gacha itself, I think Qingque is gonna be definitely future-proof. But if you really want to talk about meta, right, you want to talk about the viability in MOC and that kind of stuff, probably if we get something a little bit more consistent than Qingque, right? Another better sub DPS with more utilities, such as more debuffs to a kit, all that kind of stuff, then Qingque probably won't last very long in the meta game. But just because of the fun factor, I'm definitely going to be using Qingque for a really long time. Alright, for the next DPS we have on the list is going to be Sampo. Unfortunately, I've also never ever used Sampo before as a DPS. I don't even think I have him raised. I don't know what his kit does, all that kind of stuff. Not that interested in his kit at all. From a face value perspective, I think he might definitely see some play. When Kappa comes out, he's probably gonna show a little bit more in popularity, but for now, I don't really know where to rank him since I don't use him, so any Sampo means in the chat, feel free to comment on his effectiveness, right? Same thing for Serval, I also barely used her, especially considering that I did pull for Jing Yuan, so I pretty much stopped using Serval at this point of time, right? In the early game, I did use Serval to get through some of the stages where there are a lot of enemies weak to lightning. But right now, ever since pulling Jing Yuan, I just haven't used her that much. But if I really have to give her a rating, I'll just put her in a tier somewhere that is below Jing Yuan in terms of a lightning AoE, because Jing Yuan basically does what Serval does, but better in that regard. Any Serval means in the chat, feel free to also comment how well do you think Serval's effectiveness are, right? And then next, I think this is gonna be our second last unit is gonna be Sushang. Now Sushang, I did use her quite extensively as well. In fact, my very first content creator video is about Sushang, right? Honkai Star Rail. OG followers, you guys will know what I'm talking about. For Sushang's DPS ranking, I'm going to be placing her right behind Jing Yuan. In terms of a DPS, Sushang is more adaptable compared to all the DPS here combined, right? Because she can function both as a sub DPS that doesn't need to use skill point at all, especially when you have her E1, or she can also be played as a main DPS, constantly breaking the enemy or dealing tons of damage against enemies that are weak, right? But why is she not on A tier, right? Why is she not on the same tier as like a typical DPS? Because she also does have her fair share of flaws, right? Her flaws is basically a large chunk of her damage is lost if the enemy is not close to getting broken or broken, right? Because for crit ratio Sushang, a majority of a DPS is going to be coming from a short stance, right? Additional short stance triggers, all that kind of stuff. And this can only be guaranteed against an enemy that is weakness broken. So if the enemy is not weakness broken, then a majority of a DPS is not going to be consistent. For break effect Sushang, if same thing as break effect Seele Wolf, if she's not going to be the one applying break, then she's not going to be doing any damage at all. But she's way more versatile than I would say Heng and Hook and Qingque and all this kind of stuff, because Sushang can be placed with any team as long as the enemy can be broken very efficiently, right? So especially if you pair her with a team that has very high toughness bar multipliers, such as Mono Fire, Asta does a lot of toughness bar damage, or Mono Imaginary, Welt does a lot of toughness bar damage, then you can slot in Sushang as a sub DPS to deal a lot of damage when the enemy is broken. But her damage capabilities is really not that high, because if you take a look at her multipliers, right, her ultimate multiplier is really low, even lower than Yukong actually at level 10, right? And all her skills, they are tied to a sword stance, and sword stance needs a while to actually ramp up, because one of her traces is it stacks up to 10 times. So before it actually gets up to the full potential, her damage is really gonna take a while to ramp up. Longevity wise, I think Sushang can be pretty viable, because like I said, you can run her with any team as long as the enemy does break very often, right? But don't expect like insane amounts of damage with her, assuming the same level of relic as the rest of the team, right? Then she's gonna be a very good sub DPS. But in terms of a main DPS, I believe there are much better options to be a main DPS, because her main DPS, when the enemy is not broken, it's not gonna be there, right? So main DPS such as Welt, Seele, Yanqing, even Jing Yuan, they're gonna have a higher damage potential compared to Sushang, which is really conditional, tied to the enemy being broken, right? So that is that for Sushang. And one last unit to wrap up our insanely long version 1.1 DPS chart is going to be Yukong, right? Even though Yukong is a support, and technically she's a harmony unit, I'm still going to be ranking her in the DPS category, because Yukong's ideal build is to be a DPS, right? Very similar to Silver Wolf. Even though she's a debuffer in agility, I'm still going to be ranking her in terms of damage capabilities, because most of the time you do want to build some kind of damage on Silver Wolf. So for Yukong, right, I'm going to be ranking her behind Silver Wolf in terms of damage capabilities. I'm not talking about her buffs, her support, all that kind of stuff, strictly damage. Now, why is this the case? I think Yukong, she does have extremely high ultimate multipliers, so in the event that she can cast off her ult, it's gonna deal a ton of damage. For those of you guys who have watched some of my streams, you have seen the amount of damage I can deal with my Yukong with very mediocre gear. I think 70,000, 80,000 is really not that much of an issue. But in terms of like the DPS of Yukong, right, it's really not consistent because it's tied to the ultimate, right? Her auto attack does just mediocre amounts of damage, and her skill is completely does no damage at all. It's meant to be a buff, right? A good thing is just her ultimate. The ultimate does eat all the buffs that Yukong provides. Right? It does eat the attack buff, the crit chance buff, the crit damage buff. That's why you can see very high numbers on Yukong's ultimate. But because Yukong's ultimate cost is so high, even with all her traces and all that kind of stuff, getting her ultimate off is not going to be very common. Even worse than Seele Wolf, because at least Seele Wolf, her ultimate cost is way smaller, so she can deal ample amounts of DPS against the ultimate. Some more, the defense break, all the kind of stuff is basically tied to Seele Wolf herself, right? It doesn't require Yukong to have the stacks on Roaring Bowstring for ultimate to have the crit chance, unless you have her at E6. But that being said, yeah, her DPS potential, it is definitely there. You can see some big numbers, but don't expect to see extremely high numbers because it's just her ultimate, essentially. The only damaging thing about Yukong is her ultimate. For buffs, all the kind of stuff, like I said, we're going to talk about it more in the support section. So this is going to be the raw DPS comparison. From at a glance, I talk about all their strengths, all their weaknesses, but I'm going to need to adjust them a little bit so that not everybody's in B and you have a better looking at the final tier list, right? Okay, so this is going to be my final tier list when it comes to DPS capabilities. Like I said, this is not with regards to anybody's external benefits such as Seele Wolf. Why is she at C tier? Well, that is because if you are playing an E0 Seele Wolf, you really shouldn't be dealing that much damage with Seele Wolf, right? But of course, like I mentioned, the whole other category based on support, based on sustain, we're going to be ranking them again on their kit, right? But this is solely, purely DPS capabilities. So after adjusting the skills a little bit, instead of everybody being a B, this is going to look more like the actual chart itself, right? So let's go through a little bit again. Seele, she is the GOAT. Nobody else even comes close to her. That said, well, I think she's definitely way ahead of the curve. I think she really only loses out to Seele in terms of all the utilities and all that kind of stuff. Qing is still going to be an S tier in my opinion, because in terms of ice DPS, no one can really do what he does right now. Even though Qing has a lot of restrictive conditions such as not being able to deal with mobs or needing a shield, this actually pairs up really well with a mono ice team because you're always probably going to run your part with Qing, right? And then in terms of MOC, most of the final stage bosses is where most players have difficulties, right? And in terms of bosses, Qing is going to be an excellent target. In terms of Jing Yuan, I think he's going to be a pretty well-rounded, decent DPS. Of course, there's a lot of weaknesses tied to his kit, so this is going to be his rating. Then Sushang, all like I mentioned, then B and C, I think it pretty much speaks for itself. Lastly, just to make it clear again, Seele and Yukong, their ranking in C is purely based on their damage capabilities, right? We're not looking at the debuffs, we're not looking at their support, skills, all that kind of stuff, and all this is basically unused. So this is gonna be my final version 1.1 DPS chart, and I'm just gonna let the drama begin and let the flame wars begin. So that's all I have for version 1.1's DPS meta-analysis. This video took so long that I had to take this and I have to film this in different days, and I changed my head because it really is a lot of content, right? And I still haven't even started on the support and sustain tier list yet. But yeah, this is what my thoughts are. Feel free to discuss this in the comment section, come to my Discord, explain whatever kind of stuff, and I'm looking forward to all the juicy little comments that I'm going to be seeing in my YouTube channel, right? So with that, we've come to the end of today's content, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.